Hello and welcome to the CCAG public broadcast. When it comes to elections, it doesn't get much bigger than 2024. This year, half of the world's population, that's around 4 billion people, will cast their vote in elections in 64 countries, deciding the direction of climate and energy policies for years to come. So, what's at stake? In the past 12 months, the average global temperature has broken the 1.5-degree limit set at COP21 in Paris in 2015 for the first time. That means increasing ocean temperatures, accelerating melting of glaciers and permafrost, sea level rise, and more frequent and extreme weather events like droughts, wildfires, and floods. Meanwhile, greenhouse gas emissions being released into the atmosphere are increasing rather than going down. In short, we have a lot of work to do. Now, against this backdrop, it is vital that we see absolutely determined focused leadership on climate. And that, my friends, is the focus of our discussion today. What are the must haves, the non negotiables, the absolute red lines for the world's climate? And how can we ensure they remain at the top of the world's agenda? To help answer these questions, I'm joined today by our CCAG experts. Alice Hill, who in a moment will kick off today's meeting by giving her thoughts on climate leadership and international cooperation in light of the upcoming US election, and Sir David King. It is also my pleasure to welcome Professor Mercedes Bustamante, who rejoins CCAG following her time as General Coordinator of Ecosystem Management and Director of Policies and Thematic Programs for the Brazilian government. Mercedes, first of all, congratulations on your work with the government and welcome back. It's great to have you here with us again. I'd also like to welcome today's guest, Iskander Erzini Vernoit, Senior Associate at E3G, Dr. Eduardo Viola, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies. We have also been sent a pre-recorded question by our friend and host of the Climate Talks podcast, Seyi Adebote. Thank you all for being here with us today. It's great to have you. Now, I'm going to open today's discussion by handing over to Alice to discuss the potential impact of the upcoming presidential election in the United States. Alice, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Ade. It really is a pleasure to join you and the rest of my esteemed colleagues. This is a consequential election. It really couldn't be more stark for the United States or really the globe. We are at a crossroads in the United States on climate policy given the upcoming election in November. And of course, what happens in the United States, for better or worse, matters for the rest of the globe. The United States is the largest historical emitter, and just this year became the largest producer of oil in history ever. It's also the largest producer of natural gas. So it's got a lot of investments in fossil fuels, and whether those investments will be tamed so that we can have a cooler climate going forward is a real question. So if we could put up the slides. With President Biden, we had the president who cared the most about climate. I don't know if he's the one that cared the most, but he's done the most. He set a new national goal to reduce emissions by 50 to 52% from 2005 levels by 2030. He's formalized that. He put it in the updated NDC under the Paris Agreement. He passed the IRA. Now, that's the Inflation Reduction Act. It passed just by a sliver in Congress of votes, but it's the largest piece of climate legislation in history. It provided incentives to industry for clean energy, for everything from EVs to heat pumps to direct air capture. He's regulated super pollutants like hydrofluorocarbons. The Kigali Amendment was ratified by the U.S. Senate in 2022. And we've had the EPA issue regulations to phase down HFCs and methane. He's put a lot of attention on methane, creating an updated methane action plan with $20 billion devoted to the effort. And he also signed an executive order directing all federal agencies to purchase 100% zero-emission light-duty vehicles by 2027, and a goal for 50% of our new passenger vehicles to have zero emissions by 2030. So let's look at the next slide. What's going to happen with a President Trump if he should return? Now, very dramatically, in the first days of his election, or excuse me, his inauguration as president, he pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Accords. That came at a big cost, in my estimation and many others, that it really hurt U.S. credibility on its claims, the country's claims that it wants to lead on climate change. He's then set about really reversing or weakening over 100 rules and regulations covering air, water, and atmospheric pollution. He turned his ire on the EPA, the Environmental Protection Administration. He put an oil executive in charge. And in a very important development in terms of being able to regulate in this space, he has appointed Supreme Court justices that are hostile to administration regulatory power. And they have, even under the Biden administration, continued to chop away at the ability of the EPA and other federal agencies to create regulations, which really constrains the U.S.'s progress on its attempts to cut its emissions. He weakened vehicle fuel efficiency standards. He rolled back regulations pertinent to the fossil fuel industry and helped ramp up production. And he has a way with words. He called renewable energy a scam business. Climate change is a make-believe problem, non-existent, as well as a hoax. And if he gets elected, he said he will drill, baby, drill. He's going to repeal crooked Joe Biden's insane electric vehicle mandate, and he intends to take apart the legislation that has been passed, these climate bills that are the largest in history. It looks like he will approve new gas export terminals, which are currently on pause by President Biden. And there's a new Project 2025 put together by a very conservative think tank here, 925 pages. It's written by former Trump officials. It's a blue book for dismantling the work that President Biden has done. So if President Trump is reelected, he will enter office far more skilled and with a team more skilled and with a blueprint to dismantle the work that's been done on climate. We can anticipate that there'll be further downsizing of the Environmental Protection Agency, repealing of regulations. We'll probably see some flight of civil bureaucrats in the face of President Trump. That's what happened last time. Many scientists left the federal government, and we'll see other attempts to really rein in what has already been accomplished in the United States with cutting emissions. So let's look at the next slide. What does this mean for the globe? Well, it means that we'll have a lot more carbon and other greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere. This is a chart developed by Carbon Brief. It analyzed what would happen if President Trump is reelected. His term, according to their analysis, could lead to an additional 4 billion tons of U.S. emissions by 2030 compared to President Biden's plans. Now, 4 gigatons of carbon is equivalent to the combined annual emissions of all of the EU and Japan. So this is important. Under their analysis, U.S. emissions would still decline, but only 28% below 2005 levels by 2030, as compared to 50% if Biden were elected and pursued his current policy. So another Trump presidency matters for everyone. And I'll just take a look at the last slide. The hard thing here is that we have an American voting population that is deeply split on the issue of climate change. We have been doing polling for a long time as to American attitudes regarding climate change, and this is a poll reflecting the answers to a question as to whether climate change is a major threat in the United States. And you'll see that Democrats have a high percentage, 78% currently, that answer that question as yes, but the Republicans, it's just 23%. And we have also seen that the Republicans in the United States now have really attacked attempts for environmental action, ESG. Those three letters are now dirty words in some states. We've seen a repeal of environmental actions in states, and there is great pressure to increase drilling and exploration for oil. So the challenge is large, and there is a big question mark as to how this election will come out. So thanks for the opportunity to share.
Alice, thank you so much for that fascinating, if not chilling, presentation in some parts. Actually, you mentioned about the US voters and the fact that the Democrats are kind of more into dealing with the climate crisis. But how can we get more of the US electoral voters to see the climate change or climate crisis as being just as important, if not more important, as other kitchen table issues?
Well, that's the real challenge, isn't it? To get people to care about climate change. And of course, we are just beginning to suffer the impacts that will get much worse as we continue to heat up. I think we're beginning to see some cracks, and I don't know if it'll be in time for the election, but we have unfolding here a crisis, which is also unfolding in other countries, of the lack of availability of property insurance. So for a homeowner or a business, they can't get affordable insurance, or if they can get the insurance, or no insurance is available at all. So we're seeing that in our Gulf states, in California, some of the western states threatened by wildfire, and the Gulf states threatened by sea level rise and storms. This won't occur across the nation, but it will occur in a number of areas. And that could bring it home that this matters. Now, the reason why property insurers are pulling back isn't entirely because of climate, but it is substantially, in some instances, because of climate. And the insurers have signaled if climate gets worse, we enter an uninsurable world.
Wow.
So that could be the signal, but the time lag is great. And for Americans to understand the connection between more pollution in the atmosphere and the heating and the extreme events, that still isn't clear that they fully understand that. We've had serious, in some of our Republican leading states, efforts to really remove consideration of climate change in schools. We have a pending bill in Florida to remove most mentions of climate in their existing legislation. So there is a backlash occurring here, and that's why ESG are dirty words to consideration of climate.
That's really interesting because the holy grail, I feel, for us in the climate crisis is to get that connection, between what the lag of what's happening at present for everyday people and what is currently happening to the climate. we need to find a way to communicate that so it makes it feel urgent and imminent for everyday people. And I think once we crack that, that's when we start moving on. And that's the job of the politicians. Getting back to politics, we know that in 2017, Trump withdrew the US from the Paris Agreement. What would be the impact if he were to do the same again?
Well, I think it would be devastating to the rest of the world. That's just a signal that the US, the largest economy and the largest oil and gas producer, is rolling back efforts on climate. I think it's very serious if that were to occur, because what is the incentive for the rest of the world to continue to act when the largest historical emitter and the largest current producer isn't acting in a forthright manner?
Mm. No, it's very, very disheartening. Look, it's not. We the elections are still a way off, and we won't know
Yes.
the we won't know the results. So we're not putting saying that Trump is definitely gonna get in. But if he does, I mean, let's be pragmatic here. His views are his views, but what would make Trump change his views on the climate change? What do you think would make him change his views?
If I could understand President Trump's psyche, I would probably be able to do a lot to help persuade people. But he has a gift, I suppose, for communicating with a certain segment of Americans in a way that the Democrats are not successful in doing. And because of that, he knows what needs to be said to them. And I think that there has been huge analysis of the number of statements that he has made that are just simply false. So I couldn't predict what he
Mm,
will do or what will be particularly persuasive for him.
Uh,
I think he is just a person that isn't governed by our normal assumptions about the decision making that occurs in politics.
mm. I
can,
mean,
can I
oh, sorry, was that
can I make
Mercedes? Oh,
Well,
Eduardo.
yeah, it's the following. I mean, one thing that is in relation to the impact of the world in the world of the new Trump president is that this will be related to a growing isolationism in the American society. The Republican Party is coming back to the isolationism of the 1920s and 30s. So this is more, it's deeper than just climate.
Yeah.
It's much more about the global order and the chaotic situation of the global order with the Trump presidency. And
Mm,
it's important to remember that the first Trump president had a very negative impact all over the world. If, for example, in Brazil, it was one of the drivers, not the only one, in declining public attention in mass public and elites opinion about the need to act in Brazil.
yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Eduardo. Um, Alice, just one more question, actually. I feel we always have to try and get to the root of some of these problems. And I know we don't have much time to get into these deeper questions, and we can be a little bit surface at some points. But what would you say, what's the root behind the skepticism that the Republicans have to dealing with the climate crisis?
Well, I think it's a general skepticism towards science, honestly, and it might get to somewhat to the education system in the United States. But there's a broader skepticism. Of course, there's skepticism about vaccines, about science in general. And there is also a certain theological and Christian evangelical who are more skeptical of science as well. So, and that Christian evangelicals are a significant portion of Mr. Trump's base. So there are many factors at play, but fundamentally, I would say it's a distrust in science, but also a distrust in government and our institutions. And that's pretty much across the board. All of them are suffering in public opinion polls when people are asked, do they trust the courts, politicians, whomever.
Yeah, we're in a really strange and difficult place. It's kind of like having a car and the engine not working when people are distrusting science. If you look at that sort of analogy, Alice, thank you so much for your contribution so far. I'd like to bring Sir Dave into this. First of all, Sir Dave, what do you make of Trump and the way he talks about his energy policy and talking about drill, baby, drill?
Right.
Does that even make economic sense?
I'm going to cut right across you. I think we're having far too much discussion about Trump. If you want to know, I will sit down and try and work out what we do when Trump is elected. But at this point in time, it's absurd for all of us just to focus on Trump. I think we need to really look at the climate. The Earth is at crisis today. What I'm saying there is that the Earth, meaning our ecosystems, are under such pressure that we are destroying the very ecosystems that allow humanity to continue. And so until there's an understanding of this enormous threat to our way of life, we are not going to manage this. And I'm saying this from the point of view that if the United States had actually taken the leadership on this important issue back in 1992, we wouldn't be where we are today. We really haven't had that leadership. And finally, we have Biden, and let's hope and let's trust that Biden gets in. I cannot really continue to discuss what the alternative would look like. And if you ask me, what is the best way forward? I've been involved in the COP negotiations for many years, and I have to say it's a very disillusioning process. If you have 4,000 negotiators congregating every year in one place to discuss the same issue for 2 weeks every year, it's almost impossible. How do you negotiate with 4,000 people? And when I was in government, what I did was say to the government, I'm leading the negotiations from a bilateral point of view. So I was there in Brazil, I was there in China, I visited 96 countries in 2 years prior to the COP21 agreement. I knew there was going to be an agreement even before that Paris meeting began. And all prior meetings, I knew there couldn't be an agreement. So what I'm now going to say is critically important to manage this crisis is to get the United States, China, India, Brazil, European Union, at least that grouping, but I would include a large African country as well, that grouping together, if they could devise a plan to manage this crisis, I think the rest of the world will fall in place. Now, if you take the United States out of that equation, it's really crippling. It's really crippling because the United States for the latter part of the 20th century was the great global hegemon, and there was much resentment to that. But nevertheless, what we're now seeing is the US global position slipping, and under Trump, that would be a deliberate slipping. As we've just heard, Trump's objective is to withdraw the United States from the rest of the world. So, sorry, Ade, that's my long view. I just want to get back to Alice and say, what is your view about how we manage in a shorter period of time? Because actually now we're really running out of time. Sorry, I'm just going to extend this a moment by saying global temperatures over the last few months are well in excess of 1.5. And we're all saying, well, this is because of La Nina. But actually, this is a very excessive La Nina event, if that's what it is. We know the surface water in the oceans have been heating up very rapidly. But worse than all of this, We now have this very detailed NASA study, 37 years studying ice on Greenland. Greenland is losing 30 million tons of ice every hour. That means sea levels are bound to rise by 7.5 meters without proper human intervention. So we have major threats out there. How do we deal with this in a much shorter period of time than we're currently managing? That's my challenge to Alice.
It's a big challenge, Alice.
Well,
so David always comes with the easy questions.
Well, honestly, I think Sir Nicholas Stern had it right when he said this is the greatest market failure ever. And one of the things that I hope could be accomplished is to get the people who are invested in that, the market system, to be more actively engaged, to understand the risk that is to our current ways of living, our current assumptions, and have them step up even more. We can have state and local governments step up. All of this, unfortunately, takes time. And I will tell you, I think there remains skepticism even at the highest levels. A really interesting thing happened yesterday, or just a few days ago. Larry Fink, who heads BlackRock, which handles trillions of dollars of assets, gives out an annual shareholders letter every year. And a few years ago, he gave out a letter saying that climate change is very serious. We need to account for this in our investments, essentially putting forth an ESG agenda. He was severely attacked for that, and the state of Texas withdrew its investments in BlackRock, a significant chunk, I can't remember how many, but in the billions, I believe, from BlackRock. And so his shareholder letter this year talked about other issues. It did talk a little bit about oil and gas. But he's basically concluded that oil and gas is here to stay, and that in our current trajectory, we will have oil and gas is a significant part of our energy in 2050. So David, I do not know the answer, but I think it's firing on all cylinders with all audiences to get them engaged on this. Unfortunately, I believe the scientists' message has been lost in the modeling done by the economists, and continues, and perhaps it's because of the time difference. If you're talking further out in the future versus returns in the next 1 to 5 years, has been lost. And we need to bring that home, that in the long term, nobody's going to be making money. And everyone's going to be suffering very deeply. And of course, the poorest and the most vulnerable will suffer the most of all.
Mm.
So if I could come back, Ade, just briefly.
Briefly, please.
The biggest enemy of the climate change needs is, I believe, the oil and gas lobby. And the lobby system in the United States is extraordinarily powerful. Is it possible that the legal system could begin to really get at the oil and gas system in the sense that lives are being destroyed? Is there a way forward in that direction?
Well, let me just quickly answer, because I am a former judge. So I was on the Los Angeles Superior Court for 13 years, and then I had a legal career before then. So I have thought deeply about the role of the courts in solving this crisis. The courts will play a role. And we're seeing that in the United States. We're seeing cities, counties sue the fossil fuel companies for the damages they are currently suffering. And we have a playbook for tobacco. Similar thing happened there. Similar thing happened with asbestos, where there were suits for many years, and then eventually liability was found and it changed practices. The challenge with the courts is that they move very slowly. The wheels of justice don't turn quickly. And even if you get a lower court decision, you're going to have appeals. It's going to be sent back again and again. And the fear of liability, I'm sure, could motivate the fossil fuel companies to change, but it isn't as blunt as regulation. In my opinion, laws, regulation is the way we need to go, but we need to get the people in office in the United States who are willing to impose those rules and regulations to change the way we do business.
Yeah, look, I really need to move things on, but it's a really fascinating discussion at the moment. You know, dealing with the climate crisis is complex, but we have to caveat that, and it's overshadowed by the fact that it's urgent, and we need to find a way to overcome these complexities. Otherwise, we're in a really bad place. So thank you so much, Alice and Sir David and Eduardo, for that section of our live stream. But it's time for us to move on, and I want to turn to our first guest speaker, Iskander Erzini Vernoit, director at the North African Climate Development Think Tank, IMAL. Iskander, first of all, it's great to have you with us. Your background is in climate policy, beginning as a climate negotiator during COP 2022, and you have experience advising governments, civil society, and non-state actors on climate change. So from your perspective, if you could make the world's politicians focus on one thing, or a maximum of three things to tackle the climate crisis in 2024, what would they be?
Yeah, thank you, Ade, and thanks everyone for having me here today. And I'll try and build on the rich discussion that's come before. I think, in a nutshell, the three things that I would flag would be first, I'll lead with finance. Second, I'll go with renewable energy, and thirdly, I'll go with those that are vulnerable to climate change. And I'll try and tie this to also where we are today in the negotiations, but also some of the conversations that we're having more widely. I think definitely agree and take as a starting point the reflection by Sir David King that we're really on the edge of catastrophic risks to the systems that we face. We're almost like a sort of child on the edge of a cliff, careening towards the edge of a precipice here that we don't fully understand. And I think so. There's this sort of mitigation challenge which we've identified there in terms of keeping climate change from getting stuck on uncontrollable pathways of catastrophic runaway climate change. That's one thing. But unfortunately, also, as Sir David reminded us, global warming has already progressed to the extent that people are suffering today from climate change related losses and damages and impacts to which they have to adapt. And so I mentioned finance as the sort of cross-cutting thing because we need finance both for mitigation as well as for adaptation and loss and damage. Mitigation, I think the chief thing here is about renewable energy and facilitating that. And with respect to the vulnerable, that's the adaptation and loss and damage conversation. This year, despite all of the major elections that the world is facing, we have a major decision moment in the climate negotiations. So at COP29, the mandate from Paris is that there be negotiated a successor climate finance goal to the so-called 100 billion in climate finance that was originally put forward in Copenhagen in 2009. And obviously the world has changed greatly since, and we've seen a lot of failure on a lot of different fronts and finance among them. But of course, the finance that can be provided by the rich countries that are in a position to do so is obviously highly dependent upon political circumstances and the elections of the day. But I think, at the end of the day, there will be a choice that we will have to make come the COP at the end of the year, which is, do we want to set the ambition on finance vis-a-vis what the science demands, or do we want to set it based on our sense of where the politics are that might sort of give us reason to not be ambitious? So I think clearly a choice has to be made there that we'll have to revisit. And then just to close, perhaps, and sort of reflecting on the thoughts of Sir David, I think the point about global emissions and the fairly few large countries that they're situated in, I think is well taken. But let's not forget the importance of having smaller, less powerful, poorer countries at the table as well, such as the African countries and also the small island states. Because I think the lesson that we have from a variety of COPs, including Paris, right, is that the small island nations, small as they are, were actually the ones that were calling on the bigger countries and managed to get the bigger countries to commit to something more ambitious, which is the theorized 1.5 target. So yeah, I think let's also think about the spaces that we create and who we allow to have voice in these conversations. Thank you.
Iskander, thank you very much. That was really, really powerful. Could you just repeat to me those three points that you think are the most important ones? Again, you said finance, and the other two were
renewable energy, and the vulnerable.
Thank you. All of this discussion we're having, I think what people have to remember is we can talk about the politics, we can talk about the science, we can get really technical about this. But right now, at this point in time, there are people who are dying. There are people who are being affected, who are losing their homes, who are losing their jobs, their livelihoods, because of climate change. That's why it's so urgent. That's why we do what we're trying to do, why we're trying to make a difference, and that's why it's so important. So we must never forget that the climate crisis is now. It's what's happening now. Look, I'm going to move on to leadership on the road to COP30. COP30 is something that's really important. So David spoke a little bit about the COPs and the problems that we have in the COPs, but I want to hear from Professor Mercedes Bustamante. Now, having recently returned from government, you must have a strong perspective on current climate policy and what, as a climate expert, governments need to focus on in the lead up to COP30 in Brazil.
Yeah, thank you, Ade. I'm glad to be back to this excellent group. I was listening to Alice's presentation, and the similarities with the Brazilian situation are quite strong. And we saw all the damages that the Bolsonaro administration made in the Brazilian climate policy. I think that one of the major challenges for governance is how to bring all ministers, but also all government branches, and we mentioned here executive, legislative, but also judicial systems working together in a cross-cutting way. I think this is now, the major issue that the federal administration has to face, because we have a federal administration now that is more pro-climate action, but we don't have full support in the Brazilian Congress. So this is really this balance between the different government branches that I think is a substantial issue here. And regarding COP30, I think that the key aspect here is how we can move governments to drive a much more ambitious collective climate action. I think this is the key issue. We, as you mentioned at the beginning of this talk, emissions are still increasing, should be decreasing now. So we really need to keep 1.5 within reach. And so we need really to increase ambition, and that's come also to the point that was mentioned here, how we can have international cooperation environment, but also the finances that are needed to drive this ambition. And as a host country, I think that Brazil has a responsibility, but also an opportunity to unlock resources, financial resources to developing countries, but also show how mega diverse country. And again, I would like to come back to the point that Sir David mentioned before about the destruction of critical environments, how we can bring together this climate and biodiversity agenda. This is also a critical issue for developing countries, mega diverse countries in the global south, but also how we can provide jobs and improve the quality of life for our population. So I think these are the main critical points. And just to finalize here, remember to put people in the center of this discussion. Brazil is living now an epidemic of dengue that is related to a strong El Nino. It's a critical issue for our health system that was already recovering for the pandemic period. And this is a very good example how daily life of people is being impacted by climate change. Thank you, Adam.
Professor Mercedes Bustamante, thank you so much and welcome back. It's so good to hear your voice and those important points. And putting people first is such a great point, and it's something that it should never be lost in this. That this is about us and how we're impacting the planet. I'd like to bring Eduardo back in here. And so, Eduardo, you have extensive knowledge of the global politics of climate change alongside the domestic and international politics of climate change in Brazil. So what do you see as Brazil's role on the global stage in relation to climate change, and how is this likely to evolve as we get closer to COP30?
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation, for the whole meeting. I would say the role of Brazil today, we can synthesize in an ambivalent role in climate change. From the one side, this Brazilian administration is strongly committed to reduce deforestation in the Amazon, and a strong reduction. And it is being successful in doing this in the 14 months of the administration. Okay, so this is really a major shift in relation to the previous Bolsonaro administration, and even before Bolsonaro also. On the other side, this administration, and I would say the more powerful economic, social, and political forces in Brazil are strongly committed to increase oil exploration, production, and exporting, okay, the exportation of oil. So, though I think this is a negative role, but this is something that is done. I mean, it's not a question of this administration. Brazil has been going increasing oil exploration, and right now is exporting. It's becoming a major oil exporter. Okay, this is a new place of Brazil in the global stage that is negative. But there is one thing that is here very important, is that the discourse of the forces in favor of oil and the government and so on is one thing that is a justification, is that the other countries are doing the same. For example, United States. But most countries has retaken since 2022, the Russian invasion to Ukraine has retaken significant, strong investment in oil and gas. Okay, and in some way there has been a transformation. What was at Glasgow a kind of important goal, that was energy transition, now is redefined by energy security. And energy security in many situations imply to use what you have more as resource. And here is the oil. A lot of countries have oil, and a lot of countries have coal. This is not the case of Brazil. Coal, Brazil doesn't have. This is so in relation to the COP, I think, despite all the discourse of the Brazilian government, and very common in Brazilian public opinion, that Brazil could be a leader in global negotiations on climate. I don't think so. I think Brazil could and is right now a major protagonist. Yes, but the leading countries only can be the countries that have a significant share of global carbon emissions, so the destructive powers of this country, and is a significant technological and economical capacity for decarbonization. And those countries are United States, the European Union, UK, China, and growing in the destructive power is India also. Okay, so Brazil is not the share of global carbon emission for Brazil is 3%. Okay, so for that reason cannot be a leader. But there is one point on where Brazil can be a leader, is in promoting globally decreasing tropical deforestation. Okay, and the most important area for impact in Brazil is the Amazon, the South American Amazon, because Brazil is now reducing significant deforestation, but the other South American countries are not reducing, are not committed, just except in Colombia, but they don't have the state capacities that Brazil has for reducing deforestation. So, but the question is, the major role, in my view, in relation to Brazil, and my view is not predominant in the climate community in Brazil, let's say, is that the major role is to promote a consistent global coalition for reduction of deforestation that is 17% from land use change, 70% of global emissions. And this is also related to agriculture, where Brazil has a good potential for low carbon agriculture. So far, this has not been much. I mean, Brazil is, the low carbon agriculture is a very small piece of the whole Brazilian agribusiness, but there is a significant potential.
Dr. Eduardo Viola, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies, thank you so much for that, for giving us the Brazilian perspective, which I think is really, really interesting. Look, it's time now for us to move on to another segment of our meeting, and it's time for us to bring back the Climate Voice segment of today's meeting and to hear from our young climate leader, Seyi Adebote. Seyi, over to you.
We know that climate change is a global problem, and what that means is that it requires global efforts to address it. This kind of global effort will really be determined by the kind of leadership we see across the world, from world powers in developing countries, for example, China, Brazil, and the upcoming elections in the US. And if we look also at the African country where there's been a lot of democratic and political turmoil, I could also very quickly celebrate the recent elections in Senegal that brought forward a 44-year-old candidate. But what this means altogether is that it makes some of us think about what progress will be made on the African continent when it comes to climate discussions. What exactly does this world power and this world politics mean for Africa and climate progress or development for the African continent in the context of climate change? This is what I'm curious to hear your thoughts about. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today, Seyi. Those who've contributed the least in terms of emissions are often those who are on the front lines of the climate crisis. And this is especially true of the African continent. So I'd love to get the group's thoughts in response to Seyi's question. How can we ensure that Africa and the wider global south are not left out of the political discourse? I know we've heard from you a lot on stuff today, Alice, but I'd really like to hear your thoughts on this, Alice Hill, please.
Well, I think it's a critical point. We need to be inclusive, and that's not only the morally right thing to do and the human right thing to do, but I do think we can look at this in a self-interest way as well. That if we have huge portions of the globe that are left without much hope, without much opportunity, that is very destabilizing for our ability to all of us to thrive. And you see this being recognized by the leaders of the military in the United States and of our security agencies, that we really need to make greater investments in those that are most hurt by climate change in order to ensure that everyone remains safe. So I think on all levels, the point is probably the most important of all in our discussions is really looking at making sure that no one is left behind and that those who are already the most vulnerable receive greater protection and attention.
Well, one of the reasons why I directed to you is because the US have so much power in this in this whole change and trying to affect the climate crisis. And I think your statement of like none of us are safe until all of us are safe is really apposite in this. Professor Mercedes Bustamante, what are your thoughts on this? On how do we not leave the continents like Africa behind?
Yeah, I think there are two aspects that I would like to emphasize that were mentioned also by Professor Eduardo Viola that I think are quite important. We have also large extension of tropical rainforest in Africa and also quite valuable savannas in Africa that need to be conserved. So I think this is one important aspect. The second aspect is how we can improve food systems in Africa to provide food security while reducing the carbon footprint of our food systems. I think it's also another important aspect. And for all of that, it's important also that we can redirect resources, financial resources, but also technological transfer to the African continent to provide solutions that are related to the local context. This is also quite important. It's not just to import solutions that were developed elsewhere and are not related to the cultural, to the worldviews of the social diversity that we have in this quite important continent. I think this was one important issue. And the second one, I think this is also mentioned here. So countries are also facing the conflicting interests in the use of fossil fuels because many African countries have extensive oil reserves, but also mineral resources that are also necessary for renewable energy. So in order to do that or to use these resources without promoting more climate change, this will be also the need to provide viable alternatives for the economic growth of this country. So we really need to make this transition going faster in Africa in a more equitable way.
Thank you, Professor Mercedes Bustamante. So, David King, I'd like to hear your points on this. I knew you'd have something to say.
I do. So let me very quickly sort of add to what I said before. I said the 5 big countries that are big emitters need to get together. That doesn't mean that I believe in not including in these discussions these smaller countries. Let me come to Africa. Let's understand which is the country in the world that has the highest percentage of electricity on the grid from renewables, and that is Kenya. Kenya has over 90% of its electricity from renewables. So what we have there is a country where there are renewables locally and they are using them. And that means their imports needed for fossil fuels are dramatically decreased. That's the first point I want to make. Don't believe that African countries aren't aware of these issues. They are, and they can move quickly because their economies are growing quickly. And when your economy is growing quickly, if you grow it in the right way, you just leapfrog into the future. And I do believe that's a model that can work. But there are a number of other really critically important points. So, for example, the point about oil production, so many countries are increasing their demands for local oil production and gas production, and using, I think, the Russian-Ukraine situation as a bit of an excuse. But nevertheless, let's look at the real reason for oil production, and that is oil usage. Let's look at the usage of oil. So if we, for example, look at China, China rapidly is producing electric vehicles on the road. They've moved from 5 years ago, less than 1% of vehicles on the road being electric, to over 30% today, well over 30% today. So there's the transition that we see ahead of us, is non-fossil fuel usage for ground transport taking off. And these electric vehicles, the cost coming down dramatically. Look at the cost of excellent electric vehicles from China. They're undercutting massively other countries, not because their product is poorer and not because they're paying less money, but because they've made big strides in the technology. So what I'm simply saying is we must get away from a one-dimensional view of these problems. I do believe that many of these oil companies and countries will be finding that they've been creating stranded assets. They won't be making profits from new oil production because the demand for oil will begin to decrease, and decrease quite rapidly.
Just a point. I think in relation to China, because China is deploying electric vehicles in China and exporting a lot, and this is good. But in terms of the emissions, 75% of the electricity produced in China is coming from coal or oil or gas. So this is very important to consider, because it's not just the electric vehicles. The thing that is key is also how the electricity is produced. It's the opposite China from Brazil. Brazil has 90% renewable electric matrix. So electric vehicles in Brazil are very good in reducing emissions, but it's not the case of China.
No, you're quite right, and I'm glad you raised that point, because we produced a China report, and I can advise people to go and read our China report. We point out China has taken something like 800 million people plus out of poverty since 2000. These new middle-class people are big electricity demanders. They are producing more renewables and more nuclear energy than all the other countries put together since 2012. They're still not keeping up, and they're burning a lot of fossil fuel. Now, there's a big process in place in China to reduce their use of coal, and I do believe they're going to manage it. But we haven't got time for this. Ade's getting impatient. Thank you.
No, I'm not. It's absolutely fascinating conversation there. I think it's that some of the points you made about Africa are really important in terms of how we need to look at it in a more look at the continent in a more three-dimensional way, and how Africa could leapfrog and maybe even lead the world in our energy transition. And also the point about stranded assets is really, really important. And everything we talk about China and their move to electricity and those implications are extremely important for us to take on board. It's been such a rich session of conversation, so much in there that I'd love to continue on today, but unfortunately that's all we've got time for today. I'd like to say a huge thank you to our panel of CCAG experts and guest speakers for joining us today. I'd also like to thank everyone for tuning in at home. If you haven't already, please like this video to help it reach as many people as possible, so we can continue everything we can to keep the climate change at the top of the global agenda, because we just don't have time to waste. Until next time, goodbye.